happy and sad at the same time. Dang, everybody getting married, huh? Okay. Um, let's see. Okay, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Wanted to get a little bit of reading in. Have some basketball I want to watch, but usually it doesn't start until like 20 minutes after the time it says it's supposed to start. So let's just do that. Let's just do that. We are in the mode of trying to get ourselves tired. I already kind of took a nap today, which I think is a good sign. I think it's a good sign. Yeah. Okay. But thriftless and uncareful families, and we often heard it said that the country had to support them because they were shiftless and negligent. If they won't only perk up and be somebody, everything would be all right. Even Henry Ford, in the depth of the Depression, gave as his solution to that problem, everybody ought to roll up their sleeves and get to work. This view may be correct as far as it goes, but we wonder what would happen to those with whom the shiftless would exchange places in the large pattern, those whose jobs would be usurped, since at that time there was work for only about 70% of the total employable population, leaving the remainder as government wards. This attitude has no bearing on what might be or could be if so and so happened. It merely considers conditions as is, no matter what the ability or aggressiveness of the separate units of society. At that time, there were and still there are great numbers necessarily out of work, and the fact that those numbers comprised the incompetent and maladjusted or unlucky units and is in one sense beside the point. No casualty is involved in that. Collectively, it's just so, quote unquote, so. Collectively, it's related to the fact that animals produce more offspring than the world can support. The units may be blamed as individuals, but as members of society, they cannot be blamed. Any given individual may possibly, very possibly, may transfer from the unprivileged into the more fortunate group by better luck of the improved aggressiveness or competentness, but all cannot be so benefited. Whatever their strivings in large population will be affected, the 730 ratio will remain in merely a reassortment of the units, and no blame, at least no social fault, imputes to these people. They are where they are because natural conditions are what they are. And so, as we selfishly are concerned, we can rejoice that they, rather than we, represent the low extreme, since they must be one. So, if one is very aggressive, he will be able to obtain work even under the most subnormal economic conditions, but only because there are others less aggressive than he who serve in his stead as potential government wards. In the same way, the sight of half wit should never depress us, since his extreme and the extreme of his kind so affects the mean standard that we, hatless, coatless, and often bewhiskered, thereby will be regarded only by a little as a little odd. And similarly, we cannot just approve the success manuals that tell our high school graduates how to get a job. There being jobs for only half of them preach. This type of thinking unfortunately annoys many people. It may especially arouse the anger of women who regard it as cold, even brutal, although actually it would seem to be more tender and understanding, certainly more real and less illusionary, and even less blaming than the more conventional methods of consideration. And the value of it is a tool in increased understanding cannot be denied. As a more extreme example, consider the sea hare, a shellless, flabby sea slug, actually a marine snail, which may be seen crawling about the tidal estuaries, somewhat resembling a rabbit crouched over. A California biologist estimated the number of eggs produced by a single animal during a single breeding season to be more than 478 million, and the adults sometimes occur by the hundred. Obviously, all these eggs cannot mature, all this potential cannot, must not become reality, else the ocean would soon be occupied exclusively by sea hares. There would be no kindness in that, even for the sea hares themselves, for in a few generations they would overflow the earth. There would be nothing for the rest of us to eat, and nothing for them unless they turned cannibal. On the average, probably no more than the biblical one or two attain full maturity. Somewhere along the way, all the rest will have been eaten by predators whose life cycle is postulated upon the presence of abundant larvae of sea hare and other forms of food. As life itself is based on such a postulate. Hold on, I just want to check something really quick too. Okay, okay. Dang, for real. It's cool. What's this? Cool, cool. Um, Now picture um, the combination mother father sea hare parentally blessing its offspring with these words: work hard and be aggressive so you could grow into nice husky sea hares like your 10-pound parents. Imagine it: the hypocrite, the illusionist, the Pollyannia, the general liar, saying that it's million eggs in mass, with the dice loaded at such a ratio. Inevitably, 99.999% are destined to fall by the wayside. No prophet could foresee which specific individuals are to survive, but the most casual student could state confidently that no more than a few are likely to do so. Any given individual has almost no chance at all, but still there is almost, since the race persists. And there is even a semblance of truth in the parent sea hare's admonition. Since even here, with this almost infinitesimal differential, well, the race is still to the swift, or or slash the lucky. We are personally what we personally conceive by the term teleological thinking, as exemplified by the notion about the shiftless unemployed, is most frequently associated with the evaluating of causes and effects, the purposeness of events. This kind of thinking considers changes and cures which should be in the terms of an end pattern. It presumes the bettering of conditions, often unfortunately without achieving more than a most superficial understanding of those conditions. In their sometimes intolerant refusal to face facts as they are, teleological notions may substitute a fierce but infec- ineffectual attempt to change conditions which are assumed to be undesirable in a place of understanding acceptance, which would pave the way for a more sensible attempt at any change which might be indicated. No teleological ideas derived through quote unquote is thinking associated with natural selection as Darwin seems to have understood it. They imply depth, fundamentalism, and clarity, seeing beyond traditional or personal projects. They consider events as outgrowths and expressions rather than as results, conscious acceptance as des, desi- desideratum. Desideratum? Desideratum. What word does that mean? Desideratum. Desideratum. Des. Oh, wait. Here, let's see. Desideratum. Desideratum. Something that is needed or wanted. Integrity was desideratum. That's cool. Something that is desired is essential. Had to use desideratum in a sentence. something that is needed or desired. Integrity was desideratum. Desideratum. Cool. I kind of want to see it in another sentence. Low key. The great desideratum in a setback, in a seat on a horse, is that it should be firm. Desideratum. Cool. Desideratum. And certainly as an all-important prerequisite, non-teleological thinking concerns itself primarily not with what should be or could be or might be, but rather with what actually is, attempting at most to answer the already sufficiently difficult questions, what or how instead of why. An interesting parallel to these two types of thinking is afforded by the microcosm with its freedom or interdependency, inter, inter, indeterminacy, as contrasted with the morphological inviolable pattern of the macrocosm. Statistically, the electron is free to go where it will, but the destiny pattern of an aggregate comprising uncountable billions of these same units is fixed and certain, however much of that inevitability may be slowed down. The eventual disintegration of a stick of wood or a piece of iron through the departure of the presumably immortal electrons is assured, even though it may be delayed by such protection against the operation of the second law of thermodynamics as is afforded by painting and rust proofing. Examples sometimes clarify an issue better than explanations or definitions. There are three situations considered by the two methods. A. Why are men taller than others? The teleological answer would be because of the underfunctioning of the growth regulating ductless glands. This seems simple enough, but the simplicity is merely a function of inadequacy and incompetentness. The finality is only apparent. A child, being wise and direct, would ask immediately if the given answer, well, why do the glands underfunction? Hinting instantly towards non-teleological methods or indicating the rapidity with which teleological thinking gets over into the stalemate of first causes. Oh, wait. Let me see. Absolutely. I'll be there. Cool. All right, cool. In the non-teleological sense, there can be no answer. There can only be pictures, which become larger and more significant as one horizon increases. In this situation, the steps might be something like this. Number one, variation is a universal and truly primitive trait. It occurs in any group of entities: razor blades, measuring rods, rocks, trees, horses, matches, or even men. In the case of the approprious, variation will be toward shortness or tallness from a mean standard, the height of adult men as determined by the statistics of measurements or by common sense observations. In men varying towards tallness, there seems to be a constant regulation with an underfunctioning of growth, regulating ductless glands of the sort that one can be regarded as an index of the other. There are other known relations consistent with the tallness, such as a compensatory adjustment along the whole chain of the endocrine organs. There may even be other functions separately not important or not yet discovered, which in the aggregate may be significant, or the integration of which may be found to wash over some critical threshold. Oh, I just had a memory. Then the men in question are taller because they fall into a group within which they are the above-mentioned relations. In other words, they are tall because they are tall. This is the statistical or is picture to date more complex than the teleological answer, which is really no answer at all, but complex only in the sense that reality is complex, actually simple, inasmuch as the simplicity of the word is can be comprehended. Understanding of this sort can be reduced to the deep and significant summary. It's so better, it is so because it is so, but exactly the same words can also express the hasty or superficial attitude. There seems to be no explicit method for differentiating the deep and part, what does this say? And part anticipating understanding the all truth, which admits infinite charge, change, and expansion as added relations become apparent from the shallow dismissal and implied lack of further interest, which may become couched in the very same words. B. Where some matches longer than others. Examine similarly a group of matches. At first, they seem to all be the same size, but to turn up differences, one needs only to measure them carefully with capliers or to weigh them with an analytical balance. Suppose the extreme compromise only about a 0.001% departure from the mean. Even so slight a differential we know can be highly significant. As with sea hares, the differences. Wait, what was that one word again? Detrimental. Determinantal. Desideratum. Desideratum. Now the ridiculousness of the question becomes apparent. There is no particular reason. It's just so. I like that. There may be in the situation some factors or factors more important than the others owing the universality of variation. There surely will be some even predominantly so, but the question as put is seen to be beside the point. The good answer is it's just in the nature of the beast, and this needn't imply belittlement. To have understood the nature of a thing is itself a considerable achievement. But if the size variation should be quite obvious, and especially if uniformly were to be desideratum, essential, basically, then there might be a particularly dominant causative factor which could be searched out. Or if a person must have a stated cause, and many people must, in order to get an emotional understanding, a sense of relation to the situation, and to give a name to the thing in order to settle it so it may not bother them anymore. He can examine the automatic machinery which fabricates the products and discover it the variability which results in variation in the matches, but in doing so he will become involved with a larger principle or pattern, the universality of variation, which has little to do with causality as we think of it. C, leadership. The theological notion would be that those in the forefront are leaders in a given moment and actually direct and consciously lead the masses in the sense that an army corporal orders forward march and the squad marches forward. One speaks in such a way of church leaders, of political leaders, and of leaders in scientific thought. And of course, there is some limited justification for such a notion, non theological notion, that people we call leaders are simply those who, at a given moment, are moving in the direction behind which will be found the greatest weight, and which represents a future mass movement. For a more vivid, why is he even talking about this? I don't know. For a more vivid picture of this state of affairs, consider the movements of of an amoeba under a microscope. Finger-like processes, a pseudopodia, a pseudopodia extends at various places beyond the confines of the chief masses. Locomotion takes place by means of animals flowing into one or into several adjacent pseudopedia. Suppose that the molecules which happen to be situated in the forefront of the pseudopodium, through which the animal is progressing, or into which it will have flowed subsequently, should be endowed with consciousness, and should say to themselves that to their fellows, we are directly leading this great procession. Procession? Procession? Procession. Determination. A number of people or vehicles moving towards a procession. Okay, so like a convoy of some sort. Our leadership causes all the rest of the population to move this way. The mass follows the path we blaze. This would be equivalent to an attitude which we commonly regard as leadership. As a matter of fact, there are three distinct types of thinking, two of them theological. Physical theological, the type we have been considering, is by far the most common today. Spiritual theological, which is rare, formerly predominant, it now occurs metaphysically, and in most religions, especially as they are popularly understood. Occasionally, the three types may be contrasted in a single problem. Here are a couple examples. Van Gogh's feverish hurrying in the Arliss epoch, culminating in epilepsy and suicide. Wait, is that true? Did Van Gogh? Oh, wait, yeah, that's true. Theological answer: improper care of his health during times of tremendous activity and exposure to the sun and weather brought on his epilepsy, out of which discouragement, and suicide resulted. Spiritual theology, oh my God, spiritual theology, he hurried because he innately foresaw his imminent death and wanted first to express as much of his essentiality as possible. Non theological picture, both the above, along with good many other symptoms and expressions, were parts of his essentiality, possibly glimpsable as his lust for life. 2. Thyroid neurosis syndrome. Interesting. Theological answer: overactivity of the thyroid gland irritates and overstimulates the patient to a point of nervous system breakdown. Spiritual spiritual theology. The neurosis is causative. Something psychically wrong drives the patient on to excess mental irritation, which harries and upsets the glandular balance, especially in the thyroid, through shock resonance in the automatic system, in the sense that purely psychic shock may spoil one's appetite, or may even result in violent illness. In this connection, note the Army's acceptance of extreme homesickness as a reason for disability discharge. Non theological picture. Both are discrete segments of a vicious circle, which may also include other factors as additional, more or less discrete segments, symbols, or maybe parts of the underlying but non theological patterns which comprise them, and many others, the ramifications of which are N, and which has to do with causality only reflectedly. Theological thinking may even be highly fallacious, especially where it approaches the very superficial but quite common post hoc ego ergo propter hoc pattern. Consider the situation with reference to dynamiting in a quarry. Before a charge is set up, the foreman toots warningly on the characteristic of a whistle. People living in the neighborhood come to associate the one with the other, since the whistle is almost invariably followed with a few seconds by the shock of a sound of an explosion for which one automatically prepares oneself. Having experienced this many times without closer contact, a very naive and unthinking person might justly conclude not only that there was a cause and effect relation, but that the whistle actually caused the explosion. A slightly or wiser person would insist that the explosion caused the whistle, but would be hard to explain the transposed time element. The normal adult will recognize that the whistle no more caused the explosion than the explosion caused the whistle, but that both parts are of a larger pattern out of which a Y could be postulated for both, but more immediately and particularly for the whistle, determined to chase the thing down in a cause effect sense. An observer would have to be very wise indeed to who who could follow the intricacies of cause through more fundamental cause to primary cause, even this largely man-made series about which we presumably know most of its motives, causes, and ramifications. We would eventually find himself in a welter of thought of production and ownership of the means of production and economic whys and wherefores about which there is little agreement. The example quoted is obvious and simple. Most things are far more subtle than that, and have many of their relations and most of their origins far back in things more difficult of access than the tooting of a whistle calculated to warn bystanders away from an explosion. We know little enough even of man-made series like this, how much less of purely natural phenomenon about which also there is apt to be teleological pontificating. Usually, it seems to be true that when even the most definitely apparent cause effect situations are examined in the light of wider knowledge, the cause effect aspect comes to be seen as a rather than more significant and statistical or relational aspect acquire larger importance. It seems safe to assume that non theological is more ultimate than theological reasoning, hence, the latter would be expected to prove to be limited and constricting except when used provisionally. But while it is true that the former is more open for that very reason, its employment necessitates greater discipline and care in order to allow for the dangers of looseness and inadequate control. Frequently, however, a truly definitive answer seems to arise through theological methods. Part of this is due to wish fulfillment, delusion. When a person asks why in a given situation, he usually deeply expects, and in any case receives only a relational answer in place of the definitive, because which he thinks he wants, but he customarily accepts the actual relational answer as a definitive because wishful thinking probably fosters that error since everyone continually searches for absolutism and imagines continually that he finds them. More justly, the relational pictures should be regarded as only glimpses, a challenge to consider also the rest of relations as they are available to envision the whole picture as well as can be done with given abilities and data, but one accepts it instead of real because considers it settled, and having named it, it loses interest and goes on to something else. We'll stop there. Okay, getting crazy over here. Yeah, where did all this come from? I don't know. Cool. All right. Goodbye, everyone.